I am so pleased that Dr. David Thompson is with us today. He is one of the nation's foremost experts in school finance. He has published 7 textbooks, multiple other articles and publications around this topic. He brings a wealth of scholarly expertise as a teacher, as a principal, as a superintendent, and then here at K-State as a faculty member and a department chair in our educational leadership department. In 2012, Dr. Thompson was named a Distinguished Fellow of Research and Practice by the National Education Finance Conference, and in 2013 he was honored with the organization's Lifetime Achievement Award. So welcome, David. Glad to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your interest in school finance and how that was influenced by your experiences as a teacher, as a principal, and a superintendent.
Goes back a long ways. I went to college in the late 1960s thinking I would become a lawyer, and got interested in other things along the way. That's what education is supposed to do, not just train you and give you a set of tools. There's nothing wrong with that. But a college education proved different for me. I took a major in modern languages, of all things, and ended up asking myself, now what am I going to do with that when I finished? And the answer was I discovered teaching. And so I spent the first early years of my career in a relatively rural Kansas school district as a classroom teacher. Took a master's degree during that period of time and discovered that along the way I was taking courses in school leadership, or administration as we called it in those days, and it included courses that had to do with money. And I immediately saw the impact of money. I think I intuited it early on. I learned about it, I believed in it, and I have not wavered from that in the next 43 years that have followed. I left the state to get a doctorate degree and had been in the principalship and had been in the superintendency, and then knew that I wanted to spend the rest of those years, which ended up being about the additional 30 years as part of that 43, dealing with the impacts of money on children and educational opportunity. And that's what I've been doing ever since, because I believe deeply that if people believe that money doesn't make any difference, they shouldn't be asking for more for themselves or for their children. Instead, they ask for more for themselves and for their children, and I think that's the way it should be for schools as well.
Absolutely. So talk about some of the complexities of school finance for a district superintendent.
Well, depending on the era, it's different. When I began, we were under an equalization formula that was called the SDEA, the School District Equalization Act of 1974. I actually predated that one by just a little bit. It was a county economic index at that time, that the better educated teachers you had, meaning did a teacher have a master's degree on a salary schedule sort of a notion, the school district would receive additional aid. But there was a county economic index that was involved in that too. It was kind of the beginning of an equalization notion. But in 1974, the state was in pretty significant school finance turmoil, and the SDEA, as we call it, School District Equalization Act of 1974, was enacted. Some people call that a power equalization formula because it literally sought to give power, spending power, to school districts that had less economic tax base, perhaps had less income wealth in the school district, and that relationship was called an inverse relationship to ability to pay. That continued for 20-some years until 1992, when the state enacted the formula that we just now in 2015-16 moved away from, which is the SDFQPA, the School District Finance and Quality Performance Accreditation Act. That 20 years of SDEA was a good time for the most part. There were certainly flaws with that formula, no question about it. Some of the inequities that had been reasons for enacting SDEA persisted through it because of a lot of local choice options. School districts could choose to tax themselves at any level that they wanted to, and of course that results in some school districts taxing more, some districts choosing to tax less. For some people, that's called freedom. For the ones who are in districts who can't get their voters to behave in the fashion that they would like to, it's called a limitation. But for those 20 years, that formula operated, I think, pretty well. And in 1992, we enacted the SDF QPA, which sought to put a floor in expenditure levels and also sought that same taxpayer equalization. But it required a minimum expenditure per pupil. It capped the expenditure per pupil then at a top end through what we now call the local option budget, or LOB. And it also included a uniform statewide tax rate. That's the taxpayer fairness. All taxpayers are taxed the same. It raises whatever money it raises. The state provides aid in differential impact, that inverse ability to pay relationship again. And school districts are able to spend what they need to spend, but they're capped out so that they can't spend wildly. That's been popular until recently. Again, districts, when you ask how do superintendents behave under these circumstances, it is dependent on where they are. If they're in a low wealth district, they like the formula. If they're a high wealth district, they probably didn't like the formula so much. But at the end of the day, those equalization factors have characterized the state for a long time and are not quite so present today in the current block grant funding formula.
So you've described some of the reasons that finances can change over time, what the local taxpayers choose to vote for or against, definitely what happens out of Topeka from the legislature or even the State Board of Education. So would you talk about some of the ripple effects of educational funding and how that impacts issues in the district, such as extracurricular activities?
I've been a proponent for a lot of years that says extracurricular is one of those words that ought to be banned from the language. The reason is that I don't regard anything as extra in what schools do. I call it co-curricular. That includes school buses, it includes social workers, it includes counselors, it includes administration, it includes one of my favorites, food service. Who would argue that children who come to school hungry are ready to learn? And as a consequence, the notion of extracurricular activities or involvements in a school district's budget, I think, is just basically not where I would like to see education anywhere. Yet it is a common term. And in fact, even in the literature, definition-wise from, for example, the National Center for Education Statistics, extracurricular is the concept. But I wanted to clarify that because the ripple effects that you describe are that when budgets get tight, there's always conversations about what comes and what goes, and those things can be fairly intractable. I can remember arguments at the school board level over amount of aid from the local school district in the form of transfers between general and specific funds to food service, and people hold very strong opinions. Those things are true in other kinds of funds in a school district. But those ripple effects are that if budgets are reduced or budgets are held stagnant, the impact is that money has to come from somewhere, and the question is always where to take it from. And that's where the arguments begin. For some people, those co-curricular activities are among the most important things in the district. For others, they're the very first things that ought to go. But it's certainly, when I say an intractable sort of a notion, it's that people don't tend to change their minds about such things, but school districts and school superintendents and school boards don't have choices when they're told that they're either getting no more resources or their resources are going to be reduced. Very often there is some level of reduction or some level at least of very agonizing tension in a school district around where to make those cuts. It's very popular in the current sort of idiom way to talk about dollars in a classroom, but that's exactly the point that I'm making. Where does the classroom stop?
So one thing that I have heard of some districts choosing to do, going to a 4-day week versus a 5-day week to address some of those costs that you just described. Is that actually cost savings?
Well, I think you get a different opinion with whomever you were speaking. If you were to go to superintendents in districts that have done that, it's very much like contracting for bus services versus running your own bus service. There are districts that choose to do that. They contract it out in the belief that through some cost analysis they've performed, that's the right thing to do. And I can't argue with that. They know what their numbers and their circumstance and their condition is. There are other districts that have done their own same analysis and have come to the conclusion that it's better to own and operate that bus system. So it's really hard to know. Each individual district is its own case, and that's one thing that one-size-fits-all school aid formulas doesn't do a very good job of taking into account. It's something that our previous state aid formula and the formula before that was very sensitive to.
So we're moving to an era of a new formula. So that has been proposed. Of course, a great deal of debate and discussion still going on about that. But what can you tell us about the new block grant funding and its potential impact on districts?
There are districts that like it. Generally, there are those districts that have either been held harmless or they have gained in some manner or another. There are plenty of districts, though, I'm certain, that don't like it, either because they have lost money or stood to lose money or worried about being held harmless. But from a purely academic perspective, and here I'm leaving aside the politics of the matter, from a purely academic perspective, a flat grant has not had any real champions in people who are like myself nationally for even the last 100 years. It's in the textbooks as sort of an old way of doing things. It's in the textbook that states sometimes still do it. They tend to do it in fairly limited programming ways. It tends not to be done in the general fund sort of a way where the big dollars are. But what a block grant will do is the same thing fundamentally as a flat grant, which is ignore all of the changing things that are happening around. It preserves and makes a snapshot in time of all the good things, generally, that was in the old formula. For example, moving from SDF QPA to a block grant froze in place good things that were in SDF QPA, but it also freezes in place the things that weren't particularly admirable and then doesn't pay attention to the changing demographics that are around it. The fundamental reason for a block grant is to gain control of a budget.
So what are some of the proposed budget changes that have you the most concerned?
Well, let me actually start with something that I see as a positive event.
Okay.
There's a discussion in the Kansas legislature right now that I'm encouraged by, and that has to do with restoration of at least parts of the SDF QPA, because in our legal set of circumstances related to school finance litigation, there is the current conversation, which I think a year ago or 2 years ago probably wasn't a viable conversation, that the old SDF QPA has elements of it that need to be restored because of those equalization characteristics that I just described. I regard that as a positive move, and I hope that goes in the right direction, and I'm grateful that the conversation is happening. Things about the block grant that concern me, I've fundamentally talked about those. They freeze things in time. They block grants ignore things of the future. They're touted as being high levels of flexibility at the local school district level. But my honest professional opinion is that in the most part, if you were to go to lots of school districts in Kansas and ask the question, how much flexibility have you gained from it, is I'm too busy trying to cover unfunded expenses to worry too much about any imaginary flexibility I've received.
So what advice would you give to our undergraduate students preparing to be teachers as far as using their voice in an advocacy role at the state level?
Well, of course, it's hard for a new teacher or an experienced teacher, likewise, to have great individual impact on the deep policy debates that happen at political and even judicial levels. But that doesn't mean that these individuals don't have a voice, shouldn't have a voice, or that they don't have anything important to contribute, because they do. I think it's incumbent on every new teacher as well as every existing teacher, however long he or she's been in the business, to be very informed, to understand the questions, to be able to ask those questions and present them to their individual communities, and to be able to make their voices heard. They should not allow themselves to be cowed. They shouldn't allow themselves to not be heard. That doesn't mean strident. It means participating. Local school boards are good about listening to teachers in many instances. That gets translated upward into policy effects, let's say through either teacher organizations or administrator organizations or combined organizations that do actually have a place at the table in legislative discussions. So I think it's important for teachers not to undervalue what they can contribute to it, because they are the professional individuals who understand best what their needs are. And it's very much like, to draw an analogy here, when building a new school building, you get an architect to help you build it, but the architect generally doesn't know much about schools. You find an educational consultant who works with people in the school district to translate educational need into what the architect can then understand and produce. And I'm saying that that's the same thing here. The teacher is the equivalent of the educational consultant, and that voice is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So is there any better dollar invested than in education?
Absolutely not. You can invest it in prisons later, or you can invest it in schools today. I know that begs the economic productivity question, the production function feature that has been explored for so long in education, that if I invest $1 strategically here, can you guarantee me an outcome and a percentage on the other end? And the answer is no, we still can't, but that's because the business model doesn't suit public schools in the first place. Public schools take who comes to them. They care for everybody. There's just simply no better dollar. You're going to spend the dollar anyway. That's my real point. And what would you like to spend it on? Would you like to spend it on children, or would you like to spend it on some sort of a cleanup?
Absolutely. I so agree. We invest in our children. We're investing in the future. We're building a stronger state in every possible way. So we've had a wonderful opportunity to learn from you today. I appreciate you sharing your expertise, not only our viewers today, but also our future teachers, our future principals, and our future superintendents. That impact will continue for years and years to come as we continue the discussions around school finance. So thank you very much for joining us today.